On to our next session. Very excited to see all of you. Was super thrilled by the questions last week. All of you are brilliant. Thank you so much for putting in the effort here. This is amazing. We are now going to be looking at the Markan Wave. Remember last week we talked about the wave model of gospel scholarship. The Gospels in the early period, between whenever you think that they arose, and about the year 150, and we can even push that up. The Gospels are not particles; they're not stable entities. They are waves. They're like snowballs, accruing tradition, and it is very difficult to pin down a stable tradition, and very difficult to pin down who exactly would be an author. So I want to look though this week at how scholars arrive at particular datings. Now, I've given you all this amazing, sexy secret, but the truth is most scholars today are still working with older paradigms that assume that the Gospels are stable products with single authors, okay? So that is still where a lot of, I would say, conservatives and more traditional folks are. I'm trying to get you out of that paradigm to transform you so that we don't in the end have to argue till we're blue in the face whether Mark was written in the year 45 or 145. It really is that big of a range. But I want to explain to you how scholars might get to what can be called the low, the middle, and the high dating. And I'm going to start with the low dating. If you're looking at the Markan Wave and you want to date it as early as possible, your best step, in fact, it's quite easy. It's a very, very logical process, and people have been publishing books on this for now the better part of 100 years. What do you do first? You accept on faith the patristic Irenaean author attribution. It doesn't get an author name until Irenaeus, until we get this Katamarkan, until we get the according to Mark title. The original title of Mark, might have been like, beginning of the gospel, Archi Evangeliou in the Greek, but it came to be called according to Mark in traditional Orthodox circles, okay? So that's step one. You depend on Irenaeus. Step two, now Irenaeus, recall, is like 180, okay? So, or 185, 190. He's late, okay? Now, step two, you want to find, if you want to do the low dating, you want to find somebody named Mark. You want to find a dude named Mark within the mythic world of the canon, okay? Within the New Testament narrative world, right? Now, the New Testament itself is a product of the first century, but it has created, most people think of it as a kind of like unified product that has a stable narrative and a mythic worldview. And by diving into that worldview, by diving into that mythic world of the New Testament, the supreme anachronism, you can find a dude named Mark. You can find John Mark specifically, in Acts 12 and 15, and you can find a dude named Mark in Colossians, who's called a cousin of Barnabas, and you can also find a dude named Mark in 1 Peter. Now, are these Marks the same Marks? Absolutely not. There's nothing beyond pure assumption that they would all be the same Marks. Okay, so this is like it's like diving into a handbook of Greek and Roman mythology where you're looking for characters, and you have, like in Greek mythology, a character named Heracles or Hercules. And the Greeks themselves were convinced, like the scholars were convinced, that these weren't all the same dude. There were like 5 different dudes. They all had the same name, but they were different. But what we do today in the mythic world in the New Testament, I should say what traditional readers do, is that they look at all the Marks in the New Testament. They assume the according to Mark title, and then they go on the hunt for Marks, and they assume that all the Marks are the same. Now, what's step 3 then, if you want to continue this line of thought? So the step 3 is, again, you depend on patristic tradition, and this time you depend on a guy named Papias. Now, the trick here is actually Papias, who is supposedly lives in the early 2nd century, is only really available to us by some guy who lives in the 4th century. Okay. So it's only Eusebius in his church history who's giving us access to Papias. Okay. So when I say that, you're depending on Papias, you're really depending on Papias as received by Eusebius. So it's actually 4th century tradition. And Papias is reading 1 Peter by that time. 1 Peter, it hasn't made it into the New Testament because there is no New Testament in the early 2nd century. But he's reading this letter ascribed to Peter, and in Peter, the author, who probably isn't Peter, okay, a shocker here, but he probably isn't Peter, but this Peter says that he has a son named Mark, okay? This is 1 Peter 5:13. He's got a son named Mark, and he's greeting people from Babylon, okay? So early Christians draw 2 deductions from this. Even though there technically is a Babylon in Egypt, almost everybody identifies the Babylon with Rome, as we see in the book of Revelation, and they take the son Mark, son not being a biological son, but as a disciple. And then they infer that Peter had a disciple named Mark. And then they identify that Mark with the John Mark of Acts, who is actually not a disciple of Peter, but a companion of Paul. But in this case, they had some bad blood because Mark, this John Mark, ditched Barnabas and Paul. Okay. Again, I'm not assuming, and you should not assume, these are the same dude. And I'm not assuming, and you should not assume, that this is history. Okay. This 1 Peter 5:13 is embedded in a pseudepigraphical letter, or if you prefer Bart Ehrman's terms, a forged letter, meaning that the letter itself is based on a fictional author and presumptively contains lots of fictional things. Okay. And one of these fictional things is, or could be, that Peter had a disciple named Mark. It's like a tissue of inferences, that then are built to create a character. And the character is probably fictional, but those inside the mythic world of the New Testament take this character to be historical. And that character, that stable author, the Holy Grail is Mark. How does Papias get Mark as the author of a gospel according to Mark? He gets it from 1 Peter and making inferences from 1 Peter. Okay, so step 4, then you can follow Eusebius and follow this trail of breadcrumbs as Christians construct a story around a character. And the story of Mark grows in time, but all of that growth occurs in the 2nd century. So by the end of the 2nd century, Mark, who originally had nothing whatsoever to do with Egypt, is attracted to Alexandria. He's attracted to Alexandria, and he writes the Gospel of Mark. And if you believe in the secret Gospel of Mark, then he also writes the secret Gospel of Mark. Okay. For my opinion on that, you can take my whole course, Carpocrates and the Secret Gospel of Mark. Okay. The conclusion of modern, traditional, dare we say, conservative evangelical scholars is therefore that according to Mark must be in Peter's lifetime. And Peter, most people believe, doesn't live beyond the mid-60s. So if you believe the patristic myth, that is the myth about Mark, that started with Papias and that ends with Eusebius for our purposes, that actually goes on beyond Eusebius, because Mark, starts getting more and more miracles and a whole kind of apocryphal Mark tradition. appears. You start getting biographies of Mark by the 6th century, and he becomes the first bishop of Alexandria. So the tradition continues. But in terms of what we're interested in the 2nd century, the bare bones myth of Mark is that he was Peter's disciple, and he wrote Peter's gospel in a notebook form. All right, so that's basically how you would get a conservative low dating. And what I want to emphasize here is these are arguments that are primarily based on authority. They are made from within a religious worldview or mythic system. So it would be kind of like me going to Africa to some remote tribe and learning the sacred lore and mythology of a particular tribe. And then I go back home and I write a book that I publish with a European press, and I say, in order to explain the people, the tribe, I use their own myth and religious worldview in order to explain how they got there. So I write a book and I say, long, long ago, there was a grand turtle who arose out of the ocean, and his shell became the earth. I mean, that's not how people write books, right? People write books by saying, all right, this is the religious worldview of my subject, and here's what I'm going to tell you, based on my own external, what we call etic framework, right? The problem with taking this low dating strategy is you cease to be a scholar and you accept the mythology and the myth, and you live within the mythic system, and you don't properly separate yourself out, right? That's essentially the problem. And that's why I say most of the low dating theories, they really aren't scholarship. They're just religious mythology with footnotes. Religious mythology with footnotes. Christian mythology with an apparatus. That's all it is. Nothing in the Markan Wave. That is, you can read Mark, so-called Gospel according to Mark, up and down, backwards and forwards, and there's nothing in there that shows any real connection with Peter whatsoever. If there was a connection with Peter, it would be very surprising, because Peter looks like a dunce. Peter looks like a dunce. And in fact, the depiction of Peter in Mark is more embarrassing than Marcion ever said about Peter or any of the other apostles. Okay, everyone portrays Marcion as he had this big bat and he beat down the apostles as fools and blind. It's actually Mark who does that, and no one questions his orthodoxy. So there's hypocrisy. So Peter, there's nothing really in there for Mark, and I'm sure if Peter, read Mark, he would just consider it bad press and yellow journalism. I mean, let's face it, it is not good PR for Peter, the Prince of the Apostles. Now, what about the idea that where Jesus says in according to Mark 9:1, I'll just say the Markan Wave 9:1. Why does he say that the kingdom, some won't die before they see the kingdom of God? Well, I think actually this is one of the easier questions in case you had it. And this is like the bridge passage to the Transfiguration. So what I think that the Markan Wave is doing here is basically redefining what the kingdom would be. Most in the ancient world would consider it a large political entity. Kingdom is basileia, which you could just translate as empire. In fact, it would probably be better if we all just translated it as empire. But what the Markan Wave is doing is it's saying that the kingdom, the power of God, is manifest in the Transfiguration itself. So of course the apostles in the story are alive when they see that, because in the very next scene, Jesus is taking Peter, James, and John on a hiking trip so that he can glow in the dark, right? Well, actually, technically, we don't know if it was nighttime. So I'm mythologizing. So I think, in other words, this is about the Transfiguration. It doesn't really help us to date this particular text. I don't think there's any good reason to date this Markan Wave within the range of any of the so-called apostles. All right, so there is a middle way, though. Okay, and the middle dating is actually the majority view. These are good critical scholars who want to take the middle dating. Okay, very good people, very good people. How would you go about the middle dating? Well, most people, like Adela Yarbrough Collins, who has a wonderful commentary on Mark, she pays most attention to this little apocalypse. And the little apocalypse is what's now Mark 13, okay? And this is the scene where Jesus says that there's going to be he's looking over at Jerusalem and the temple buildings, and he says there's going to be no stone left on another. No stone left on another, okay? Now this is what is called in scholarly terms, okay, which means fancy jargon terms, a vaticinium ex eventu, okay, a prophecy that is from the event itself. In other words, a prophecy that isn't an actual foretelling of the future. It is a fictional foretelling of the future based on events that have already happened. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that these sorts of prophecies, they can lead to genuine prophecies. Like there are genuinely future events in the little apocalypse, but most scholars think that this is not one of them. So Jesus says that there's going to be no stone left on another, and it is true that the Romans did. It is definitely true that the Romans did raise Jerusalem in the year 70, in the summer of 70. Okay, it's definitely true. But Josephus says that they left the western wall, and you can see it today. Here it is. This is actually my photo, you know, where they have, this is an interesting spot in Jerusalem, where they have left a bunch of rocks that have been thrown down. But then you see the Western Wall. And that's like the living memory of the nation, of how great they were. And the Romans, they wanted to let people know how great the city of Jerusalem was and how impregnable it was in order to celebrate their accomplishments. So they did leave one wall. So what Adela Yarbrough Collins says is that this prophecy in Mark, that there's no stone left on another, it's close, but no cigar. It's close, but it's not precise, which would mean that the author of Mark, conceived of as a singular dude, had a general idea that the Romans had won, but he had no accurate information. In other words, Josephus had not yet been published. And so that is why Adela Yarbrough Collins says that, well, it has to be right on the cusp of 70. It's anytime between 68 and 70. That's her dating. All right, so you see the logic of this, and we can come back to this in the questions in case this isn't clear. But what seems to these proponents of the middle dating is that the author of Mark knew that Jerusalem and its temple would be destroyed, but he didn't know everything in detail. He did not know everything in detail. So he can't be, so the assumption is that he has to be very close to 70, because if he had read Josephus, or if he had visited the site, he would not have actually threatened to put a false prophecy in Jesus' mouth. Well, it's sort of like a 90% true prophecy in Jesus' mouth. It's true, but not quite true, right? He would not have risked that. He would not have risked confusion. And that's why you have so many scholars who hold up 70 as this lightning rod. And, you know, the conclusion here is that Mark is written shortly before 70. I'm just, you know, taking this from Adela Yarbrough Collins' commentary on Mark, which is a fantastic commentary and which I will recommend at the end. Now, what's interesting is that conservatives, that is, those Christians still living their mythology, and it's fine to live your mythology, I don't have a problem with that, but you just have to recognize what you're doing. They still like the 70 benchmark. They're okay with 70. You know, even though Peter supposedly died, you know, 5 to 10 years prior to 70, they're still okay with 70 because 70 still allows them to get what they really want. And what do they really want? What is like the holy grail of traditional religiously based gospel scholarship? It is to allow for eyewitness memory, to guarantee the truth by the fact of eyewitness testimony. Without this, you know, it's like Christianity stands or falls, right? They don't want it to be pushed much after 70. Why? Because the apostles are going to die. But 70, that's okay. They can live with 70. So there's a kind of alliance here, and when you realize what's going on in terms of the politics of New Testament scholarship, this really becomes quite clear. Why is it that the majority view would be 70? It's because the middle dating folks and the low dating folks have joined hands, and they make up 90%. 90% of the paid scholarship. These are the people with jobs who are in seminaries and they get money to teach the Bible. All right. And yes, and they use this to their advantage, right? Everyone wants to use this argument. The argument is called the consensus Gentium, because most people believe it. It's probably true. Because most people believe it's probably true. We see this all the time, right? It is a fallacy, by the way, and this is the technical name of it, the consensus Gentium, the consensus of the people. We know that that's not necessarily the case. That's a fallacy. We have to be open to many datings, but what's most important is we need to be open and to fully understanding how they got there in the first place, right? So I'm going to present to you the high dating of Mark now, okay? And I'm going to base it based on part of what we know from the middle dating, okay? The high dating, I think, focuses primarily on that same chapter in Mark, the little apocalypse, okay? It can go other places, but this is the focus. And it definitively takes no stone on another as a prophecy after the event. It's not just a lucky guess. It's not just a good guess. It's an actual prophecy after the event, okay? Because no one can really predict what's going to happen, right? But you can write a historical fiction in which your characters accurately predict what's going to happen, and your characters are still in the past, right? You can do that. That's quite fun. And why would you do that? Some very traditional scholars ask, why would they do that? Why would they do that? Well, because there's a very simple answer here, and it's because the focus of the Gospels was never on whether the prophecy was exactly right. The focus was always on Jesus's authority. And if you can convince your readership that Jesus was himself a prophet who was reasonably accurate, that's what this is about. So Jesus predicts his death 3 times. He predicts the fall of Jerusalem. All that happens. So it's a self-authenticating device. Now, you can believe that it's true. Now, I don't care. But understand its narrative value in the story. Jesus gets it right. Jesus gets it right, and therefore is a legitimate authority. That's what this is about. Okay. All Christians want to do is they want to say that what Jesus says is true. All right. That's like prime goal number 1, okay? So let's look a little bit more closely at some of the language in the little apocalypse. And I'm not sure if this is original or not, but here are my observations, okay? When you see the language of kingdom against kingdom, or empire against empire, we're talking about very large entities. And my question is, does this actually fit a system or a chronological setting of 70? And I don't think that that's the case, right? Because the war in 70 is not a war of kingdom against kingdom, empire against empire. It is a war of a very, very, very small city-state against a gigantic empire, okay? But when did we have empire against empire? Well, they did eventually get to that. That was the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And when they really, really clashed was with Trajan, right? Trajan attacks the Parthian Empire, goes very, very deep, reaches the Persian Gulf, imagines himself as a new Alexander. That's empire against empire. Earthquake. I think this also better, this is another prophecy in the little apocalypse. I think this also better fits Trajan's time. I don't know of any well-known earthquakes between 66 and 70. But I do know that one of the most famous earthquakes of antiquity was that earthquake which almost killed Trajan himself, and which was in the great city of Syria, much greater than Jerusalem was, and that was the city of Antioch. In December of 115, the building in which Trajan was governing began to collapse, and the only way that the emperor saved himself was literally by jumping out a window. Everybody knew about that earthquake. Everybody knew it because every city in Syria within a 100-mile radius of Antioch was destroyed. That's a big earthquake. Okay, and that's December 115. All right. So empire against empire. It's the beginning of Trajan's war against the Parthians. Big empire, centered in Iran, but stretching from India all the way to Syria. Okay. Persecutions by governors and kings. I like this one. This is also part of the Markan Wave prophecy. When do Christians start getting persecuted by governors and kings? Well, let's face it, folks, despite the mythology of Acts, and we'll get to Acts, despite the mythology of Acts, it is, I think, a historical fact that most governors and kings, until the early 2nd century, do not even know who Christians are. We have a letter from Pliny the Younger, about 110 or 111, writing from Bithynia, probably, in which he says, he writes back to Trajan and he's like, I've got these people called Christians, don't know them, don't know their mythology, don't know anything about them, and I don't know how to deal with them. Can you please inform? Can you please inform? This is a Roman governor. This is a Roman governor. And this is really the first time we get to see a Roman governor dealing with so-called Christians, okay? Prior to that, do we see Christians standing before governors and kings? Not really. In Christian mythology, we do. You know, these apocryphal acts in the late 2nd century start depicting Peter and Paul before Nero. But that is highly anachronistic, right? Highly anachronistic. It makes for a fun story. I mean, it's good. You know, it's interesting. Because they also throw in Simon of Samaria there, you know, and he flies over Rome, and, you know, it just gets better and better. The fiction just gets better and better, folks. But that's the thing, it's fiction. Historically, Christians did not stand before governors and kings because they weren't numerous enough to even appear on the Roman radar until about this time. Okay, so again, we're in the Trajanic period. What about this most famous of all passages, the desolating sacrilege standing on the temple? The desolating sacrilege standing on the temple. The Markan Wave has an interesting feature here when he says that there is a desolating sacrilege, or literally an abomination of desolation. An abomination of desolation. And the abomination is a neuter Greek word, but it's standing, and that word standing is actually masculine. So it's like ungrammatical. And actually in the Matthean Wave, we'll see that he corrects this because he just wants to improve the grammar, as you would, you know, normally. You know, even Microsoft Word will correct your grammar. You know, so they want something that reads better. But I think it's interesting, you know, to look at the mistake. If you've got a masculine entity standing on the Temple Mount, I think that better fits a situation in Aelia Capitolina, where we have a definite statue of Zeus and of Hadrian to boot, standing on the Temple Mount, standing on the Temple Mount. Now, again, people want to move this to 70, and I totally understand the logic, okay? They want to say that the abomination of desolation is like the Roman armies, but the Roman armies, for most of that time, they weren't on the Temple Mount, they weren't in the temple, okay? Some people want to say that it was Titus who did, as the temple was burning, you know, take a tour of the inner sanctuary, and, you know, just like Pompey, you know, before him in 63 BCE, he's like, there's nothing here. So, you know, what are these people fighting over? You know, I mean, this is a true story. It's something that Josephus tells us. But Titus, although this episode, you know, might have been seen as defiling, he doesn't stand there. He doesn't stick around. The temple is burning. It's not anything about standing. And Titus doesn't leave anything on the temple. He just leaves it as a ruin. So there's no permanent abomination standing there, okay? So I find it very difficult to fit this situation in 70. I honestly do. I honestly and truly do. And I don't know what your opinion is. We'll find out soon. False messiahs. False messiahs. this is another prophecy. So who would these false messiahs would be? Well, most people would point to Josephus and point to figures like the Egyptian and Atrongis and Judas the Galilean, okay, and some of these other figures in the revolt. And I think that that's quite legitimate, right? Even though most of these figures aren't directly called messiahs, it seems like Simon ben Giora in Josephus was thought of as a kind of messiah. But it's interesting that when you look at Jewish sources, the only person that Jewish sources recognizes as a messiah is actually Bar Kokhba. And that's, it's in his very name. It means son of a star because it's based on Numbers 24:17, where the star rises out of Jacob. It's a messianic prophecy. And even a very well-respected rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, recognized Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. Okay, so that was a big deal. That was a big, big deal. So if you're thinking about false messiahs who don't last a day, they don't, go to the Jordan River and then suddenly get their head cut off, but real threats to Christians and real threats to the Romans, that's Bar Kokhba, who holds off the Romans for 3 years and, according to Justin Martyr anyway, executes Christians who confess that false Messiah, Jesus. Why? Because they won't accept his messiahship. That's a serious threat to Christianity. If you're going to prophesy about anything, I would prophesy about this guy. Okay, sorry, I've already said this point. I'm just going to move on. Where are we? So I've given you the basic sense of how a scholar would go about dating the material, either the low dating or the middle dating or the high dating. Now, how do we implement what we know about the wave model or the notebook model into what we're talking about today? How does that affect the dating, right? Because the real problem in scholarship is not that we disagree about the dating, but that we make the assumption that there are stable texts. And therefore, if you choose 70 as the date of Mark, then you have to stand your ground and argue to your blue in the face against someone who chooses 45 and against someone who chooses 135. But actually, the wave model doesn't force you to do that. The wave model is actually quite liberating. So if we imagine a timeline, anytime between, I'm not going to bother with the earlier datings because I think they're within Christian mythology. But if you're somewhere in the line of critical scholarship, you're probably going to put Mark between 68 and 135. So what do we imagine happening in the wave model? Well, there's not one stable author of Mark. There's many, many micro authors who are pushing the tradition along and writing at different points along that continuum. And as that continuum continues in time, new details and nuances and differences are added to that Markan wave. Okay. And so if you imagine a snowball, okay, picking up traditions and revisions as it goes along, that's sort of like the wave model. I guess we could call it the snowball model as well. We could have this. We could definitely have this. And each of these people pushing along this snowball are the micro authors who are making little changes. And what happens as you make little changes? Well, you don't get rid of the stuff, or you don't get rid of all the stuff that was there already. You improve it. So we can conceive of a situation in which the Markan wave picks up traditions that are dated at various points along the timeline. And that explains why it's so confusing when he's actually writing, because that's the trick. He's not actually writing. It's many people who are writing and thinking of their own time. And what you get at the end is a final product which includes information from any variety of times, right? And it also explains why scholars can never agree. So I like this model. You may not like it, and that's fine. But what I'm talking about is an accretion. We could also call it an accretive model. People are reading and writing and improving the literature. Because remember, until Irenaeus, it's nameless literature. So it's like authorless notebooks. They're improving it. And so by the time, of course, we get to Justin and Irenaeus, what we call the Markan Wave is looking more and more like literature. And what we read in Mark 13 is actually a very well-written little apocalypse. I quite enjoy it, and I hope you do too. But the issue is, and my main point is, that this little apocalypse will fit different times, and it will fit different historical circumstances because of the nature of how it came to be. All right. So I'm trying to be ironic, and I'm not saying that the people with the low dating or the middle dating or the high dating are necessarily flat out wrong. I'm looking specifically at the middle and the high dating, okay. But I don't think that, say Adela Yarbrough Collins is flat out wrong in how she dates, because I think there are bits and pieces of the 70 situation in Mark 13, and there is even bits and pieces of earlier stuff, like going back to the 40s with the crisis under Caligula, where he tries to put his statue in the temple, and this is what Christians fear might one day be successfully implemented. So my advice to you is, when you see people who are like, oh yeah, Mark is definitely written at the year 70, be very cautious. At least be very cautious. Any responsible scholar, I think, speaks more in terms of date ranges. And in fact, we have quite a large timeline for critical scholarship. Anytime between 68 and 135, I think, is a very responsible date range for Mark. So here, as promised, are two commentaries of Mark, which I highly recommend to all. Many people, when they think commentary, might think like your pastor's newsletter. But no, there are actual commentaries that are written by critical scholars, really, really good people. And these two series, the Hermeneia series and the Anchor Bible series, are what I typically recommend. Okay, so Adela Collins has her Hermeneia commentary, which is massive. And then Joel Marcus has an Anchor Bible commentary. Both of these are fairly recent. And then if you're interested in Mark in the 2nd century, I recommend, here we have an Australian here, Michael Koch. He's out in Perth, Australia. He's got a very readable book called Gospel on the Margins. So if you're interested in this, I can send affiliate links to anyone who's interested in these. But these are very, very good works. There's a lot that's not good, and so I'm trying to direct you